Hello and welcome to the ninth episode of the Wagner Students for Criminal Justice Reform podcast. I am your host, Thurston Powers, and with me tonight is Sheba Rivera, our director. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Thurston. This is perfect time for me. I'm so thrilled. 10 o'clock at night is like my prime time. So happy to be here and be talking to you right now.
Yeah, both of us are kind of night people. So Sheba and I tend to have similar arrive at them from very different paths. In discussing various elements of healthcare proposals from the ACA, Paul Ryan's Better Way, Medicare for All, we ran into a bigger picture question. Is healthcare a right?
hmm And from that,
Oh, hold on. I just heard that my mic cut out. When did it cut
yeah, well,
out?
when you had mentioned that what we were going to be talking about today, but I did hear healthcare, and then from there we started discussing what actually is a right.
Yeah. So is healthcare a right, Sheba?
I believe healthcare is a right. Um, but it's really hard to start there. Um, how do you feel?
So I come from sort of the idea of sort of like negative rights and positive rights, and that negative rights are the natural rights that the country is founded on. So for me, I view healthcare as only a right if someone injures you or if the state does something that makes you sick. In that case, you are owed healthcare. So, for example, my right to life allows me to defend myself. My right to liberty allows me to fight off enslavement. My right to property allows me to protect what belongs to me. I'm allowed to use force, even deadly force, to protect my rights. But do I have the right to force a doctor to treat me? What can I do to him if he refuses to treat me? And if I can force someone else to work for me, how is that different from slavery?
Good questions. And my belief is that at this point we've gotten to a point where we can start to answer some of those questions, and we can also think critically about how we've created this what I believe is a false dichotomy of negative and positive rights. For instance, to say that civil and political rights are negative rights and that economic and social rights are positive, I think is missing a few things. For instance, many things need to be in place for us to have civil and political rights. Political rights have to do with running for office, voting. There needs to be many things in place for those things to happen. Even civil rights, you need to be able to have people who can investigate and see whether your civil rights have been infringed upon. You need to have people to enforce these things, and all of that takes money. And when it comes down to enforcement, uh, we think about what do we need to do to redress the situation. And I think with economic and social rights, that's a lot of the time what we're doing. We're looking at how were exploited. And because of that, because of situations beyond their control, where usually other people had a part in it at some point, they lost the ability to be able to get things that would give them the right to life, which is food, water, reasonable, clean water, sanitation when it's possible and available. So those things happen because no one protected their rights. And so the lack of that enforcement created their need.
So the idea that negative rights are not and positive rights are the same thing because negative rights require a positive right enforcement. I mean, isn't a positive right like enforcement the cost to the state of being allowed to govern? It's the debt incurred uh, from the sort of like the idea of the consent of the governed, where yes, you can have laws, you can have police, you can do all these things, you can tax us, but in return, we are allowed to have representation. And if you do infringe on our rights, we are allowed compensation.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I see rights a little larger. I do agree with those things, but I also see that corporations are should be required to respect your rights, that other people should be required to respect your rights. So I don't think that it only comes from the government, and it's only about what the government owes to us. For instance, if a corporation or a person took things that belong to you or
They would owe you,
exploited
of
you in some
course.
way,
That's part of enforcement.
exactly, and I think if you look through the dawn of time, like these things have happened. I mean, it's created a lot of the inequality that we have today, and because of that, there are people that don't have the access to food and water that otherwise they would have had. So I think that a lot of these philosophies come out of the convenience of not having to worry about having these things. I mean, these philosophies have come from people who are usually um, privileged. They have their needs met. A lot of times they were white men that were involved in some sort of colonialism or slavery. And it was very convenient for them to say, well, listen, I'm not doing anything wrong, and you shouldn't take anything that I have, even though at the time they were exploiting people. And then in return, they would lay on to that other rules that would say that slavery was okay, or that it was okay to take property away from other people, and make caveats to this in order to grow their own wealth. And I think we were
But what
talking
you're
about one of those
describing
people.
is the violation of negative rights.
So I'm talking about both. Actually, I mean, so I think what I'm talking about here is, you know, we were talking a little bit about John Locke before. Um, Someone who's yeah, maybe you want to say a little more about him. You probably know a little bit more about his philosophy on liberty.
Yeah, so John Locke is the father of liberalism. His book, The Two Treaties of Government, is a literal interpretation of the Bible. And that's what the U.S. Constitution is based off of, a particular interpretation of the Old Testament. And basically, from that, he argued that um, people have a inalienable God-given right to life, liberty, and property. Um, and so these are negative rights. And when the state or a corporation or a slave owner infringes on your negative rights, you have the right to fight back and kill the slave owner.
Hmm. And meanwhile, while John Locke was saying that, he actually was very much involved in the slave trade. He was it, kind of the modern racism has roots in a lot of his philosophies. He also said that it would be okay to take land away from indigenous people and African people, claiming that because they don't know agriculture, or at least that was his interpretation, that they did not know how to cultivate their land, that it would be okay to take their land from them. And then in response, his view is that no one could take this land from him. So I think that you have to look at that in its totality, and see that he came up with this as a way to protect what he was taking away from other people. The other people were being exploited by him.
And I mean, I think you also have to consider the fact that people tend to be not as good as their principles. So John Locke was, like many of the people back then, wealthy slave owner and did atrocious things. And yet his ideas, 200 years after him, were being quoted by Martin Luther King, pointing out the hypocrisy of many of these people that founded our country, and said, look, they said all men are created equal. All of us have these negative natural rights. The problem with America is that you're not applying negative rights equally. The problem is that you're not respecting the rights that all men are given by God.
And I think a lot of the problem, as we're seeing it now, is we're quoting things that Locke said as opposed to things that Martin Luther King Jr. said. So I see a problem there. That we're I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. He needed to use Locke's words. Unfortunately, he had to bring up how the hypocrisy that is in our nation. And Locke was opposed to actually defining what man meant. That's how hypocritical he was, but these things at that time in the civil rights era, they had to be brought up because there's hardly any other way to get people's attention, except to bring up the hypocrisy and the racism that it was founded on, and how that you needed to get away from that racism for any of these things to make sense.
Well, it was the racism of people, not the principle.
Well, I think the principle is racist, yes. Well, I think the principle is problematic. And the reason why, like I said, is because it says that I can take what you have, but you can't take what I have. That's what it was built on. And as for the next generation, now you can't touch the next generation because they inherited all of this wealth. And the fact that you inherited nothing or you inherited slavery is just natural law. And that, I think that was what it was founded on. And we need to get away from that.
But does the natural right to property mean that I can take your stuff? Because by definition, it means the opposite. Now, the fact that some racist individuals proceeded to take people's stuff anyways and violate the non-aggression principle, that does not mean that the right to property is wrong. In fact, the right to property is what keeps people from stealing your stuff today.
Yeah, I think that would be a different argument, the right to property, and it's complicated. I think that how we have capitalism set up, property is impossible to get away from. For instance, you can't get a loan without saying that you own certain property. There are a lot of things that you won't be able to create. You won't have access to a lot of what I believe are economic rights without being able to have rights of property. And I do think that is also problematic. And I wish there were some ways about
specifically.
And I wish there were some ways around that. You wouldn't have the right to actually cultivate your own land because you wouldn't be able to get any of the materials, even seeds or the equipment. Normally you'd say, well, you can use the land as collateral or something like that, but that's hard to do if you don't have any land, or you can't say you own the land that you're actually living on, and so because of that, those things are problematic. There are societies that don't work that way, and there are societies that don't see debt that way, and so in those cases, it's not as much of an issue. But I would agree that right now in this country, or even in other countries where capitalism is run that way, that's a necessity. Eventually, maybe we'll be able to create some new paradigms, though.
So what I'm still trying to wrap my head around is the fact that people were racist and took people's property, violating their negative property right. How does that mean that the property right is bad today? How does that make sense? Because today what it's doing is it's letting like a 93-year-old woman tell Donald Trump, no, you can't have my property.
Right. And it works for some people and not others, unfortunately. I mean, you look at the Dakota Access Pipeline, and people's property is being taken away from them, either by eminent domain or otherwise. And so,
but eminent domain is
so the problem
government.
is, and this is the reason why I'm saying it's racist, is because when people take the property, they say that you can't take it back. That's usually how the conversation goes. So when people are exploited, then they say that it is not right for them to have access to anything that you have. So you could own so many things because your parents exploited so many people, but that's okay because no one can take what you own. So to me, that's problematic. We need to think a little beyond that, and that's what Locke was going for. I mean, that's how he created the wealth that he had.
Yes, again, but he's like 270 years dead.
Right. So maybe we should move beyond Locke. I'm okay if we move beyond him. Maybe we should.
Well, the man is dead, but the idea that I can't steal your stuff, that I can't enslave you, that I can't kill you, those are still good ideas.
I would definitely agree. Although I do have an issue again with the I can't take your stuff if it's something that you exploited me to get, or generationally exploited me to get. But yeah, I wouldn't argue that those are profound ideas, and I think he used them, and applied them in some horrendous ways. And I think some of his ideologies betray that, and so we just have to recognize that, realize some of his ideologies were imperfect, like this idea of negative and positive rights. I don't think that that was. I don't think that.
Well, I mean, those kind of came a little bit after him, but uh, well, I mean, the negative and positive right division wasn't explicit in his arguments. Um, but so again, like who, like the rest of Locke's work isn't what we're talking about. Like Plato had some good ideas and like some terrible ideas. Same thing with Aristotle. But we don't throw out the good ideas just because they had some bad ones.
Right, and I don't think that was a good idea. Like I said, I think that was founded in a oppressive ideology that I will take your stuff and then you can't take it back. So I don't think that was a good idea at all. I don't think that we
But
should
that's not
found
the idea of negative
our
rights.
society on that.
I mean, that's not the idea of property rights.
But that's the only way to
That's how they
apply it.
were applied,
I
but
and
that's not what they are.
I'm not going to argue with you that we don't need to have rights. I do believe in rights. I just don't believe it in the way that he said it.
All right. So you mentioned the pipeline. Now, one of the big problems with the pipeline is the small sliver of land that is technically this weird limbo space between tribal land and federal trust land. Now, if that were privately owned land, we would not really be having this problem, right?
You're saying if the land was actually owned
Privately,
by
like if the
by
tribe
the Native
owned the
Americans.
land instead of this weird sort of federal mixture, the federal government wouldn't have been able to say like, oh, well, we're going to put the pipeline here. If the tribe actually owned the land, they would have been able to say, no, period, end of discussion, right?
So do you know how that came about?
No, tell us.
So there's a treaty actually, where that land was supposed to be given, I believe, to the Sioux people. Now I am no expert in any of this, so I don't remember exact. I think it was in the 1800s, um, and then the government actually seized the land anyway,
Mhm.
much time later, and the the people went to court, and the court agreed that that land should not have been seized, and they said that the government should pay the Sioux people a certain amount of money, but did not say the land should be given back.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I would argue that their property right was violated.
Yeah, and I would agree, and I would also say that when the um, the oil that even recently has actually leaked into the water, which is where, or the river, which is where they get a lot of their water from, that violated their right to water. I would say that there's a lot of violations going on here.
Yeah, I would classify having their water violated as part of their property right violation. So they should be owed either cleanup or monetary compensation plus whatever healthcare like costs are incurred by polluted water.
So I have a question for you.
Mhm.
If they were displaced, if now because of this they have to move to another area, do they still have a right to water?
So your question is, if they move, do they have a right to water? Um, no, I think that they have the right to either the land, the compensation, like so.
So
If
if someone's
someone
displaced
deals,
because of their their rights being violated. If someone
Mhm.
is displaced because of that, they lose all of their rights to water and food and shelter.
Well, they lost the property, which included water and shelter and
Right.
food. So they're owed like however millions of dollars would buy them the equivalent.
Okay.
So,
So we
so
agree.
like think about it.
So they do still have that right.
They have right to compensation. Yeah,
Hmm.
if I
So what if
damage
someone
your
is displaced?
car,
What if someone is displaced internationally?
so then you
They
have
have to
sort of
flee
the
where they live.
problem of the commons, right?
They
Where,
have to flee where they live, and now they're somewhere else. So they still have a right to water and food.
I mean, again, water and food, that's weirdly specific. I'd say that they are due compensation. And the like easiest solution to that would be money, then they can buy water and food.
So until that money comes, they don't have a right. They only have a
They
right
have
to
a
compensation. So they better
they have
live.
an indebtedness.
They better live. The courts better act really fast because they have no right to water for the next 3 days. They only have a right to compensation. I mean, it puts us in a predicament, right? To say this person has a right and that person doesn't because of property, which has some
Wait,
ambiguity.
wait, when did they not have a right?
No, as I said, you can say one person has a right and another person doesn't.
No,
So
I
one
say
person
they
had a
all have
right to.
rights.
Okay, so even the person who was displaced, they have a right to water,
They have
or
a
only the
right
person who had property with water on it.
they have a right to compensation. That can take the form of water.
Okay, but if that compensation doesn't come immediately, they've died. So did their rights not matter?
No, their rights did matter. It's like an example of why we need better courts or whatever. Like it, or like why didn't any sort of charity organization reach out to these people? Why didn't anyone help them? Like we have plenty of organizations that help with refugees.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that nonprofits and NGOs, I mean, they take on a lot of this responsibility. They, of course, can take it all on. But I think what I'm driving at is that if we are assuming that, yes, this is something that would be a need and this is something that comes from property, and that it's almost common sense, then it's a right. And we can't say that with everything. And I know that there are many things people say that are rights that are not, but there are these things that which are known as economic and social rights, like food and water, that I think people have the right to. And I don't think we need to go back and see, well, was the water going through your land, or did you have land, or when did you have land, and when did it get taken away from you? I think there's a lot of exploitation going on in the world, and at some point we all have a responsibility um, to recognize that many of us benefit from the exploitation,
So
in many different ways. And if we
hypothetically,
do, we should
what
be
happens
paying back.
when if I get displaced and I declare that I have a right to water, what am I allowed to do in order to get that water?
So I think I look at, I'm not like a strict communist, and I definitely look to people as being the source of power here, um, which I think a lot of those philosophers back in the day also believed. And I think it does come down to communities having a responsibility to take care of each other.
Okay,
Just
so
recognizing that people who have things usually have it because things went their way at some certain time. And very simple things like food and water, we should be able to recognize that there's enough to go around. It's just that some people got it and some people got exploited.
so
Some
let's
people
say I'm
weren't born
displaced
with that.
and I turn to my community. I say, "Okay, I'm displaced. Provide me water." And they say, "No." But what am I allowed to do to them to get water? Because I have a right to water, right? So am I allowed to kill people for water?
Again, I think it's about the community. And I think it always is. I mean, there
But specifically, what about the community?
even when it's your right to life, now we have courts, you know, which I think how they're run is very problematic, you know, that's very, very violent, how we take care of our civil and political rights, you know, alone. But I do think that there are some better ways that we could recognize as a community people's economic and social rights. I don't think it comes down to one individual. I think a lot of the people who are affected this way, they don't have the ability to necessarily struggle and fight back for every single thing that they need. They may not even understand what they need because they're just trying to make it day by day. Um, so no, I do
So,
think that comes down to communities.
see, what I'm trying to drive you towards is the idea that if a court is taking a long time to process my case, the state has put me in a position of limbo. So the state actually does have a responsibility while it's processing, giving me due process to maybe keep me alive. So
So
I'm agreeing with you somewhat, but I'm saying that the reason why you have the right to some sort of subsistence while you are in limbo, legal limbo, like some sort of assistance, is because of the limitations of the state. So basically, the state is saying, okay, we're not going to let you go back to your farm and kill this guy who took it. We're going to go through the legal system. And the legal system takes time. So we're going to give you like a little bit of assistance while you wait for your case to be settled. So that's applying a burden onto that individual or that community that's been displaced.
mhm.
And so that community is owed something in response for in return for the burden. Um, but that doesn't mean that like there is a universal right to food and water.
I didn't get to C from A and B.
Okay, so like let's say that you decide to come over here and take my house. Um, I technically like have the right to fight back and whatever, but let's just say like you come in like um Mad Max style with like 50 guys and they're all armed to the teeth, and so like I peace out. Um and then I go to the courts. I'm just like, you're not going to believe this, but Sheba Rivera just led like a small army to my house and took it over. Uh like, can you do something about that? And they're just like, okay, but it's going to take about 8 months. And I'm just like, well, I'm homeless and I have no money, and I technically have the right to go kill them. And they're like, no, 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 we're a system of laws. It's like, okay, well, then you have to, help me out while I wait for you to take back my house. It's part of the what you owe me by being allowed to govern me.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think I love it. I don't have a small army. So it sounds very unlike me, so I don't think you're going to win that case.
I think
But I
you,
wish you the best.
I think you could muster one. You're very
But
charismatic.
this is yeah, well, this is very similar to kind of I think what John Locke was going for too. He believed in putting the power in the hands instead of the state to the church, and he believed in killing apostates, people who thought differently than you or atheists. Um, yeah, I don't think that's the answer, and I'm not one to say that something is only a right if the state or the church can provide it. Like that's not where I go with it.
But that's not
I
what
don't think these are. I don't think
that's
that
not what
the
makes it a right, though.
right. I don't. I agree. That's not what makes it a right. Um, and I think that it comes down to, for instance, are corporations required to respect your rights?
All people are required to respect your rights, and
Right.
corporations are
So,
people.
so many times, yeah, corporations can be people, or they could be, you know, legal entities to make sure that they are not people. And a lot of times, those are the people that actually have control over this. I know we're talking a little bit about like UN instruments. They actually, recognize this a couple times, and they have these guiding principles that they try to put out, and to make sure that also businesses understand that many times you're the front line. You're the one who either has the choice to respect someone's rights or not, and so I think we have to sometimes look beyond the state, and it's not always what the state can give us. It's what might need to come from our communities.
No, it's what the state owes us.
And you
It's what the
see,
state owes us.
I don't always come from there. I do think that people have benefited in many ways from exploitation, and I think it's really easy if you just say someone came and stole my land from me. It's really a lot harder when you can point to generations of exploitation and stealing.
By the way, do you mind if we circle back for one sec? So in Locke's second treatise of government, he points out that if someone attacks you, you should not be the judge, because you're probably not a unbiased judge.
Right, you might not
and
be
so he outlines that the state
or the church
should be the judge. And that gets improved upon by later philosophers, jury of the peers and whatnot. So again, like that idea of sort of like due process, that is what incurs a responsibility on the state. Like that process is what I'm talking about. So in that case, it's not what can the state give you, it's what does the state owe you. And that's like, for example, like in the US Constitution, the right to a speedy trial. That's to mitigate the limitation on liberty that being in pretrial detention imposes on the individual.
So if there is no state
trial,
what if there is no state?
Oh, here we go into the ANCAP or ANCOM. Sorry.
Well, I mean,
no.
The reason why I ask this is because I just don't think that it's always the state that took it from you. So what are we dealing with if there's not a state involved?
Well, if there's not a state involved, then we're basically dealing with organized crime syndicates that form out of mutual interests. So, like for example, your band of raiders realized that like you are a good leader, and you guys formed your collective, and you guys really wanted my house. I should, in retrospect, I should have joined a gang as well.
Okay, so this is great. So now that gang of raiders took my house, don't they owe it back to me and not the state?
Well, without the state, there's no recourse. Instead, it's just unless you've got a bigger army, they now have it.
Right. So now it's been a few years and nothing's happened, and my kids haven't been able to like have much food. They're stunted, and experiencing stunting. It's all very sad. The people who stole it have died, and their kids have inherited it. Who owes who what? No.
Well, I would say that the kids, they didn't do anything. Yes, they benefited, but that's like cosmic injustice. Unless they've actually done something to you, it's unfortunate. I'd say that the property, I mean, if you're still alive, then you might have a claim to the property. But there's no, like, you can't send the people who are dead to jail. You can't charge their children with it.
Yeah, well, I'm not a fan of jails anyway. I'm a prison abolitionist, so it wasn't that. Hopefully, it was not the solution. But I think that's an interesting thing to call it, cosmic injustice, and I do think that's what a lot of philosophers went for too, just saying, well, this is natural law, this is God's will. I don't think that that's God's will, and I think that when there are people who don't have, there's 4 billion people in this world who are living off of around $2 of purchasing power per day. Something we probably, most people listening to this podcast, everyone listening to this podcast cannot even fathom. And a lot of that happens because of exploitation, including in this country.
I still think that negative rights are the best way to stop exploitation. The problem that we usually outline is that their right to property, life, and liberty are not being respected by large corporations or by despotic governments.
But I think a lot of what's happening with that argument is that people are saying, okay, and it starts now. So it's always people who have things, people who have shelter and they have food and they have water and they have education and they have healthcare and their needs are met, and they say, okay, go. Like, we're all good, right? Now everyone keeps what they have.
But how far back do you go? I mean,
I don't think you need
Africa, for example, did not have very many for example, like it was impossible for Central Africa to develop like very large cities or towns because of malaria. Like, that's cosmic injustice, that there would happen to be a particular virus that when you reach a certain population density broke out into just horrific like plagues practically. That's not fair, right?
I agree, and I'm glad we circled around to healthcare, and we get to talk about it all. We might have to talk about it another time. Yeah, I agree, and I think we're no stranger to plagues. In America, we had plagues. There were plagues in the Western world, but the Western world benefited from colonialism, and there were things that the Western world benefited from that Africa did not, and unfortunately they don't have the same ability to be able to fight some of these things that we do. And it's, again, you can't really just say, okay, now go. And
but
not pay attention
what do you
that other people don't have these things because of colonialism or exploitation.
So there were also for example, when China gets accused of exploitation, they also, in the process of like mining in Africa, have built incredible infrastructure that has allowed for the transportation of life-saving drugs and the creation and of electricity, which, as Bill Gates pointed out, is one of the strongest predictors of infant mortality reduction. So, I mean, there are benefits and there were costs. That's no excuse for anything, but it's not like industrialization was a bad thing.
And what kind of government does China have?
Totalitarian, yeah.
Communist, one party.
They've been trending away from communism since the 1980s, luckily.
They also are one of the countries that have affirmed social and economic rights.
Then why are they being accused of
colonialists? But China has, which I think is interesting.
Colonialists, then? I thought that only Western colonialism.
Oh no, I wouldn't say that. I think we're still searching for the ideal form of government. I don't. If there is one, right? Like, I mean, government's always going to have flaws because it's people in power.
No, I'm just surprised that you would call communist colonialists. Like, usually people aren't willing to acknowledge that.
Oh, I think I said I wasn't a communist. Like I said, I think we're still searching for the right type of government. I don't think that there's any pure government out there.
Yeah, I mean,
but we're critical thinkers. I think we could get there, but we do have to recognize, I believe.
I disagree that there is a correct government, because I think that basically government is a complex problem. Like, how much government you need and how much and what government should be doing is constantly changing depending on what sort of challenges the government faces. And like the kind of government you need when you're like being attacked by another country is very different from a government when you are not.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that it does come down to principles.
Yeah,
And yeah, like I know a lot of times we say, well, what if all of this happens and then what do we do? And we think about the wars and murders and things like that. I just think about the structural violence that happens way before those things happen. And the things that we let go and we allow to happen to groups of people that really end up creating some of these more horrible situations. Um, I think we need to address those. And, Amartya Sen, when he talked about the right to, certain economic and social rights like education, food, water. He mentioned that usually it is the countries that are um, that don't have these things that end up becoming radicalized. And there was the UN when they went to there was a special rapporteur of the UN that went to Burkina Faso and noted that it is because there is that difficulty in just getting these essentials to life that leads to frustration among young people,
but
and that leads
that's
to
like a
violence.
utilitarian perspective, and like from a utilitarian perspective, providing like public education and like water fountains and all these things, like I can go with that on a utilitarian perspective as like they are good ideas, but that doesn't make them rights.
So I think that those are reasons to institutionalize or like solidify these rights. But I think you're right. I don't think that that in itself is the reason.
Then
I
what
certainly
what
think
is
that
the reason? Like, why
it
is
gives it
education a right?
credence, though. So and when we create, a society with these certain things that we determine are necessary in order for the society to run the way we all want it to run, we create the need to create these rights. I mean, we have things start to change. We're not hunter gatherer societies anymore. We're not bartering with chickens in our backyard anymore. Like so much has changed, and because of that, we need to recognize um, what is a right in society today. And I think some things end up coming to the fore, like healthcare. And then when you recognize, okay, well, if people have healthcare, that means they're not spreading disease and we're not all dying. We can see, okay, if someone's sick, they should go to the hospital. We should find out what it is because maybe it's not a cold, maybe it's something that's more serious, and they can spread that to me. Um, then we start to realize, okay, this should be institutionalized. Like um, this is not just a right because we've created a society that only functions this way. It's a right because it affects it affects me. So even if someone comes in it selfishly, I think they realize that it needs to be institutionalized. Even from that negative right perspective.
So let me try to see if I can follow this. So your argument is that because other people are sick, that will violate the non-aggression principle, and therefore I have the right to like force them to have health care. Like I have the right to tax them.
So I would go for the difference principle. If we have to if we have to connect everything to a principle, I would go with something that's saying, the people who do not have are should probably be prioritized, which is John Rawls. I don't think that, again, principles that came from people who were exploiting other people are necessarily the ones that we need to follow. They had a reason why they thought those principles were important.
So okay, so basically what you're saying is that um they have the right to health care because it's a good idea. I'm just trying to see what
No,
is this
no, not
anchored
at
in?
all. I was using that because I think that if nothing else, if you have to come at it from just purely a negative right standpoint, that is reason enough to institutionalize it as a right. Um, but to me, that's not what makes it a right.
Then what does make it a right?
The fact that we've created societies that function this way,
In
and
what
that
way?
only function this way.
Like that's that I mean, you could say that about anything. Like you could go back like in a time machine 200 years and go, well, slavery is a right because we've created societies that function this way.
I think we have a difference in view on what society means.
Okay, then
But
how do you define
I
society?
agree. I agree that it's conversations like this that lead us to decide like what is a right, and
Oh, we decide what's a right. Oh, okay. That's dangerous because
listen,
like
I
that's
don't.
how we end up with slavery.
I'm talking about dialogue, because I don't think the only way that we run things is by having principles like uh, utilitarianism, things like that. I think that sometimes we need consensus-based decision making. We need to consider all parties. We need to consider things like, who is affected most by a policy, by an issue. We need to think about generational harm. We need to think about structural violence. Like I think those things all come into play, and you can't just boil it down to like, well, this thing's negative and this thing's positive, so they don't
How do
get
you
it.
control for
Uh,
tyranny of the majority if it's based off
I
consent?
agree. Yeah, right. There should not be tyranny of the majority. There should be consensus-based decision making. I'm glad you asked. Is like um, making sure that everyone is has a say, and when someone disagrees, finding out why. It's a slow process, but it's also um, a much less violent process to be able to see why there are disagreements. Otherwise, people who are um, in some way don't have the same abilities, different abilities than other people have, they're going to be marginalized.
So what if like like I don't know, the EU says to Switzerland, hey, get rid of all your guns. Like we've all talked about it and we've heard your complaints. We know that you are a country that values the individual right to life and self-defense, but we would really feel more comfortable if we took away your guns.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
what sort of I mean, what do they do in that case?
So I have a hard time going from something like food and water to the right to own a gun, and I get the argument because if one person has a gun or if one person has the ability to hurt me, why can't I? But I don't know. But for
Because your
that, maybe
life.
they should all have tanks. Like I don't know. There's almost not an end to that argument. Also, I mean, I just can't relate the guns to food. I mean, someone who's dying slowly because they're starving or they have some disease, they might wish for a gun to end their life. But I'm not going to say they need to get a gun. I'm going to say they need to get food or health care. So I really think that's where we need to start.
Well, okay, so what if well, so how exactly would you say that uh consent, so you say that education is a right and healthcare is a right. So why is healthcare a right in the United States if we don't have consensus on it?
You're saying, well, it's not an
So
institutionalized right.
okay, so
It's
it's a
not a human
human
right. I mean,
right that's just not recognized.
if there was a country that had slavery, I wouldn't say that now in that particular country there's no right to liberty. It's just that it's not recognized by the state.
So so you're saying that these rights exist outside of the state and yet they're
Absolutely.
decided by the people. So like, do I have a right to like an armored like battle mech in like some distant sci-fi future that just isn't recognized yet? Do I get to pilot Voltron someday?
I have a question. Do we not give someone the right to water because you're thinking about a distant sci-fi day where
I'm
someone
just
might
looking for
want
a
a Voltron or
consistent. I'm
something?
just looking for a consistent definition
And I
because
think that while we're looking for, I'm sorry, go ahead.
you're saying that there are unrevealed rights there are human rights that exist outside of the state, and you're also saying that new states are new rights are created by like society slash the state at like over time. So if this is true, that just because a country that currently has slavery still has the right to liberty, because like in the future it will have liberty, maybe. Don't I have rights that I don't even like know about?
So when I say, it's a good question. When I say time, I mean like millennia. I think that we've had the right to education and healthcare for millennia since, this we've formed these communities and we've realized that ways to be able to help people through healthcare, we've made it accessible. Like that's not new. I think that that's been around for as long as civilization's been around. I don't think that that's something I can't imagine we have any huge big things happening, but I don't know. Punctuated equilibrium is, evolution is a thing, maybe. I don't know. So, like, there could be changes to that. I don't see that forthcoming. I think that for millennia, we've had the right to education and healthcare.
Hmm. So there weren't really that many doctors like a millennia ago. So, like, how do you square that with that being like a right?
I don't know. We had healers for a very long time. Sometimes they had useful remedies, sometimes not. So we're still using their remedies, a lot of doctors now, trying to go back and find out what people knew that we're not using, and find a way to patent it and make money. So yeah, I think that has existed, and I think a lot of societies believed that if someone in their community needed healthcare, that like the healer visited them, and that's just what happened. I don't think that that was questioned. I mean, it wasn't until people started looking at, well, how is this going to affect the money I have in the bank, that we started to want to deny these things.
Hmm. So, huh. That's an interesting perspective that basically these are just rights that we haven't known about. I mean, that's sort of addressed in like the Ninth Amendment, but usually that's thought of like sort of in the perspective of like, what if the state imposes some other burden on the citizens and therefore owes them something? Um, yeah, I have to think about that. I just don't see how it is that I have the right to defend my rights, but the only way I can defend my right to like education if someone refuses to teach me is to use force and violate their rights.
Right. And I think that usually it doesn't come down to that. It's
But it can.
usually,
Like if
usually,
I'm just like, hey man, like teach me geometry, and they're like, no, like I don't have the right to like beat the crap out of them because I don't have the right to make them teach me geometry.
yeah, I think it comes down to the structural violence that put someone in a situation where they just didn't have access to it. I think those are the things that we need to look at. And I think you're right. It doesn't come down to starting to point fingers at this one teacher, and this one student. I think that there are structures that have been passed down, but we need to find some way to recognize that and recognize that someone's right to liberty at one point was denied. Their right to be able to live on this earth as a dignified human being was denied. And how can we fix that?
Well, they fought back, and they that was within their right. So
Who fought back? Wait, every person has fought
people
back.
who were being oppressed, like
Everyone who's oppressed has fought back.
no, but I suggest that they do.
All right. So you
But
give out the guns. I'm going to give out the food. And
hey, there's some Christmas sales. Like, I'm telling you, ar15.com. It's a good site. Um, but yeah, no, I don't see how to square that circle where like if I'm living under like an oppressive state, Like I have the right to like rebel, or if someone tries to enslave me, I have the right to fight for freedom. But if someone doesn't teach me, doesn't give me something, that somehow allows me to attack them. Like I still don't why do I have the right to extract something from them?
Yeah, but why is that violence, but not what has happened to you violence? Like, why are the structures that have put you in this situation not also a form of violence?
No,
You
they
know,
are a form of
emotional
violence, and
violence.
that's why violence is justified as a response. You're allowed to fight back, but
Yeah,
I'm
so
not allowed to go steal from you.
I am in favor of creating new structures where we don't resort to violence, where instead we resort to filling those what I feel are human rights, so we don't have to continue to resort to violence. And there's a really wonderful saying that says, you know, when you are privileged, even equality will feel like oppression. And I think that that's, you know, a lot of people who look solely um, on like my right to keep what I have see things that way. Well, you know, anything that changes what I have is oppression. I don't think that's true. I
But
think that we need to
you didn't
recognize
answer the
equity.
question though. So like these
What's the question?
structures, like for example, people argue that um, it's like for example, universal healthcare is volunteeristic, um, but it's not. It's just a structure that basically imposes a system of taxing and a system of hiring to make sure that the trade happens. Same thing with public education.
Mhm.
But that still doesn't mean that I have a right. It's a gift. It's a gift. Basically, what's happening is that the government is taking from someone in order to create this service that I can then use. So that's the structure of universal healthcare.
Yeah, I think it's a
But
structure a lot of governments that
yeah,
they take things and then they say, I mean, I think that we have done that for a
but
long
that doesn't
time.
make it a right. It makes it a good idea, but it doesn't make it a right. If I had the right to it, I could go take it.
That's not how I don't think that violence is my criteria for, you know, criterion for determining whether something is a right or not.
Well, what I would say is that you have, if it is a right, you have the right to defend it. And whether or not that involves violence is, depends on how violent the other person is in trying to take it from you.
Yeah, and there are some people that use that terminology of like taking back. I just don't see it as that terminology. But I do think that you have a right to something. I don't think that it should have to be taken by violent means. Like I said, I think we need to come to different terms of society, and it's not just about the state.
Well, that's why we have, yeah, well, that's the purpose of the judiciary system, to remove the need for me to use violence to protect myself, to not be enslaved, and to protect my property. That's the point of the judicial system, to remove violence from the equation.
Oh, well, it's
Um, but
also the role. Oh, go ahead.
uh, but I mean, I don't see how um, an entitlement, like, or a gift from the state, is something that is a just a human right. I'm still not hearing that argument. I'm hearing we'll change the structure so it's easier to get, or that it's accessible, and that's fine. Like we can do that. I would argue that in some cases that's a good idea, but changing the structure doesn't change whether or not it's a right.
No, I think it's a right just to begin with. I
From
mean, if
what?
people I go with Amartya Sen. I believe that we all have a right to a dignified life. I think that those things like food and water, I think there's a human rights because we literally can't live without them. And it doesn't take someone actually putting a knife through you. I don't think we need to go down to that barbaric sort of definition of, you know, unless I actually take a knife to you, I'm doing something violent. I think violent things are done um, all the time, and that affect us and affect our rights.
Hmm.
Affect our
Well,
rights.
I agree that eminent domain is violence.
Absolutely. We should
I
give
believe
back
that
that land
taxation
except
is
for
theft. um, yeah, and for those who are listening, like the taxation is theft. That's a half joke. It is theft, but there needs to be like an acceptable amount of theft necessary to create a state which can protect individual rights. So that's sort of the classical liberal perspective on it. Um, but yeah, so I'm I'm open to hearing arguments for positive rights, and let's do a follow up on this because I want to be convinced. I do, I really do. Sound good?
that sounds great.
Okay. If you guys enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe and have a good night.
Yeah. And comment and tell us how we're right and wrong.
Yes. I always want to hear how I'm wrong. Thank you.
That's why you like me.
Yes. Have a good night.
Good night.